Donald Trump didn't just walk into a CNN town hall about women's issues. He walked into a room where his favorite reflex had already been measured, cataloged, and timed. For years, whenever a woman challenged him, questioned him, or simply outshone him on camera, he reached for the same word like a security blanket. Nasty wasn't just an insult in this story. It was a tell, the verbal tick, that showed up right before the temperature changed. And this time, the woman facing him knew exactly what that word was designed to do. The event was pitched as a reset, a softer hour of television meant to reassure skeptical female voters. His team wanted a controlled environment, a friendly format, and a predictable rhythm of questions that would let him sound empathetic without having to be accountable. They wanted testimonials, not confrontation, and anecdotes, not patterns. They wanted him to say Ivanka, say opportunity, say respect, and get out without stepping on a rake. But they also made the mistake that keeps repeating in modern politics. They assumed the stage itself would do the work for him. Because across from him wasn't a pundit chasing a viral moment, or a rival trying to out-insult him with a sharper insult. Across from him, in this account, stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, framed not as a partisan flamethrower, but as a former public defender with courtroom muscle memory. She didn't prepare by memorizing policy lines or rehearsing applause cues. She prepared the way a trial lawyer prepares, by studying behavior the way a mechanic studies a failing engine. When a system breaks down, it usually breaks down the same way, in the same places, under the same pressure. Her focus wasn't a single scandal or a single tape, because in politics, single moments get litigated into dust. Her focus was repetition, the shape of it, the consistency that survives spin. In her world, patterns are evidence, because patterns outlive excuses. If you can show that the same move happens again and again, you stop arguing about intention and start talking about habit. And habit is harder to deny, because it's right there on the record, waiting to be replayed. The central issue wasn't whether Trump had ever said something crude, or whether he had ever apologized, or whether his supporters believe he doesn't mean it. The issue was simpler and more corrosive. What does his language train people to expect from women? What does it normalize when a powerful man treats female pushback as a personal offense, and female authority as a provocation? What does it do to the culture when the most famous political figure in the country reaches for contempt faster than he reaches for argument? And what happens when someone finally refuses to debate the details and instead puts the pattern on the screen? That's the setup that matters here, because it reframes the entire encounter. If you treat the town hall as a standard political clash, it becomes an endless tug-of-war between he said and she said. If you treat it as a study in rhetorical control, it becomes a demonstration. And demonstrations don't need shouting to land. Crockett's method, as presented in your text, is methodical precisely because it doesn't give the audience an escape hatch. She isn't asking people to adopt her ideology. She's asking them to recognize something they already know. Millions of women don't need a lecture on sexism to understand coded dismissal. They've heard the vocabulary for it in offices and classrooms and hospitals and church basements. They've been told to smile, to calm down, to stop being emotional, to be nicer, to not take it personally, as if their professionalism is a mood problem. They've watched the same assertiveness praised as leadership in a man and punished as attitude in a woman. So when Crockett frames nasty as a tool of control rather than a random insult, she isn't inventing a new theory. She's naming a familiar experience. Trump's side, in this narrative, enters the night thinking it's about performance. He expects a camera-friendly format where dominance reads as strength and interruptions read as energy. He expects the audience to respond to confidence, even when confidence is just volume with a tie on it. He expects his personal charisma, or at least the myth of it, to carry him through. And he expects his favorite move, the quick label, to end the argument the way it often does on a rally stage. But this audience isn't a rally crowd, and the room isn't built to absorb slogans. The story emphasizes that it's 200 women from across the spectrum, not a single tribe chanting in unison. Some arrive with hats, some arrive with protest pins, some arrive with no markers at all, and that mix matters. Because the moment you strip away the tribal cues, what's left is recognition, and recognition is the enemy of spin. You can argue facts with people, but you can't argue with their memory of being talked down to. Crockett's opening posture, as described, is calm enough to be unsettling. She doesn't try to out-alpha him, because that's the trap where any woman who meets force with force gets labeled as too much. Instead, she chooses restraint, the kind that forces the other person to reveal how badly they need control. She invites him to do what he always does, because the point isn't to prevent the pattern, it's to capture it. In a sense, her strategy is to let the reflex fire, then hold it up like a fingerprint. And that brings us to the real question driving the opening. Not, do you respect women, because that's a prompt designed for a rehearsed answer. Not, would you take back what you said, because that turns everything into a debate about tone and timing. The question is, how many times have you called a woman nasty? Because it drags the issue out of abstraction and into arithmetic. It takes the conversation from values to evidence, from vibe to record. That's why the opening works when it works, and why it hits a nerve even in a hypothetical retelling. It doesn't ask the audience to dislike Trump, because half the country is already tired of being told what to feel about him. It asks the audience to watch him, the way you watch a person you're trying to understand, not a caricature you're trying to hate. It sets up a test that is almost unfair in its simplicity. If you say you do it to men too, name one. And if you can't, the silence does the talking. The narrative choice here is sharp because it doesn't rely on a single explosive accusation. It relies on contrast, and contrast is persuasive when the viewer can see it without being coached. Trump leans on familiar claims of fairness and grievance, while Crockett leans on receipts and rhythm. He asserts, she demonstrates, and demonstration tends to win on television because it feels like the camera itself is a witness. Even people who distrust CNN as a brand understand what it means to watch a person dodge a basic follow-up. Now, there's a reason this story centers the word nasty rather than a broader catalog of insults. Nasty has a particular cultural weight because it pretends to be about character while functioning like a leash. It's not a policy critique, it's a personality stain, a way to tell the audience, don't listen to her, she's unpleasant. It shifts the conflict from substance to likability, and likability has always been a weapon used disproportionately against women. Men are allowed to be forceful. Women are punished for failing to be soothing. That's where the domestic violence framework enters the story, and it's the most delicate piece to handle responsibly. The text doesn't need to claim Trump is an abuser in a legal sense to make a point about control language. It uses Crockett's professional background to explain something many people learn the hard way. Control has a vocabulary. Certain phrases show up whenever a woman resists, and the phrases are chosen because they isolate, shame, and shrink. In that framing, nasty becomes less a description and more a button. A controlling personality presses to regain the upper hand. If you've never experienced that vocabulary, you might hear it as ordinary rough talk. If you have, you hear the intent underneath, the demand that the woman return to her assigned role. That difference in audience perception is what makes this kind of town hall volatile. Half the viewers watch for policy. The other half watch for social truth. And social truth doesn't wait for a white paper. When it lands in the body first, as a memory, as a flash of recognition. The opening, then, is really about setting the terms of interpretation. Is this a conversation about the former president's feelings? Or is it a conversation about his habits? Is this a performance about how much he loves women, or an audit of how he speaks when a woman won't flatter him? Is the audience supposed to be charmed, or is the audience supposed to notice? Crockett's approach, as presented, pulls the viewer away from charm and toward notice. And there's a second layer that matters for a YouTube-style political commentary. Even if you keep your analysis neutral, you can still be honest about persuasion mechanics. People don't change their minds because you call them stupid. And they don't change their minds because you scream louder than they do. They change their minds when you make the story in their head stop fitting the evidence on the screen. In this narrative, the evidence isn't just clips. It's the moment the reflex reappears right on cue. That's why the opening can move quickly without feeling rushed. You don't need to spend paragraphs explaining who Trump is because the audience already has a relationship with him, positive or negative. You don't need to spend paragraphs selling Crockett as a hero because the story's power comes from her method, not her mythology. You just need to put the central claim on the table. The word nasty isn't random, it's patterned, and patterns reveal power dynamics. Then you need to let the viewer watch the pattern try to defend itself. So the opening ends with the tension that makes the rest inevitable. A candidate who believes the room will reward dominance meets a lawyer who believes the room will recognize control. A man who thinks insults are strength meets a woman who treats insults as evidence. A format designed to soften him becomes a mirror held too close to ignore. And once a mirror is up, the only question is whether he can resist looking into it. Once the opening question is on the table, the exchange stops being theoretical and becomes mechanical. Trump answers the way he always answers, by flattening complexity into bravado and insisting that repetition equals truth. He says he calls men nasty, too, that he is equal opportunity, that the charge itself is unfair. It's a familiar move, one that relies on volume and confidence to blur memory. But the power of Crockett's approach is that it doesn't argue with his self-description, it tests it. The first silence matters more than any insult. When asked to name a single man he has publicly labeled nasty, the pause stretches just long enough for the audience to feel it. It's not a dramatic pause staged for television. It's the pause of someone searching for a lie that fits the record. In political debate, silence often gets edited out or talked over. But here it's allowed to sit. And in that space, the audience begins doing the math themselves. What follows isn't a gotcha in the usual sense, because it isn't built around a new revelation. It's built around recognition, the slow accumulation of moments people half remember but never lined up side by side. The clips aren't shocking individually, because most viewers have seen some version of them before. What's different is the sequence, the rhythm, the way the same word keeps reappearing at the same moment of challenge. Pattern turns memory into evidence. When Hillary Clinton is interrupted mid-answer and labeled a nasty woman, it isn't framed as ancient history. It's framed as a data point, one tile in a larger mosaic. When Kamala Harris is described as nasty, simply for being elevated into national visibility, the insult loses its pretense of provocation. When Nancy Pelosi is called nasty for opposing him, The word reveals its function as punishment for defiance. The insult stops being personal and starts being procedural. Trump's response to this shift is telling, not because it's surprising, but because it's automatic. He doesn't contest the clips one by one because that would require precision. Instead, he reaches for the familiar shields: context, unfairness, media bias, provocation. He reframes every example as self-defense, as if criticism itself were an act of aggression. That inversion is central to the story, because it's the same inversion many women describe encountering in everyday life. Crockett's calm becomes an accelerant in this moment. Her refusal to escalate forces Trump to escalate alone, which makes his reactions feel unbalanced. In confrontational television, energy is often mistaken for strength, but here it reads as loss of control. Every interruption underscores the very pattern she's outlining, without her needing to underline it. The more he protests, the clearer the structure becomes. This is where her background as a public defender becomes relevant, not as a credential, but as a lens. She explains, without dramatizing, how language operates in controlling relationships, not with legal jargon, not with accusation, but with examples that feel uncomfortably familiar to many viewers. Words like difficult, crazy, emotional, and nasty aren't neutral descriptors in that context. They are tools. They are deployed to delegitimize resistance and reassert hierarchy. Importantly, the narrative doesn't require the audience to accept a clinical diagnosis or a legal conclusion. It asks them to recognize behavior, not assign labels. This distinction matters for credibility, especially in a polarized environment where exaggeration is expected. By focusing on language rather than intent, the argument stays grounded in observable fact. Trump said these things in these moments, under these conditions. The Access Hollywood tape functions differently in this framework than it usually does in political debate. It isn't introduced as a scandal to be relitigated, because the public has already done that. It's introduced as a control sample, a glimpse of how he speaks when he believes there are no consequences. The contrast between that private language and the public nasty becomes the point. One is crude entitlement spoken freely. The other is contempt laundered for broadcast. When the tape ends, the silence in the room isn't just shock, it's fatigue. Many of the women in the audience aren't hearing it for the first time. They're hearing it again. The repetition is part of the experience, the sense that this behavior keeps resurfacing no matter how many times it's addressed. Crockett doesn't dwell on the tape, because dwelling would turn it into spectacle. She lets it sit as context, then moves back to the present. The audience questions shift the dynamic further, because they break the illusion of a two-person duel. When women from different professions stand up and describe being labeled difficult or aggressive for competence, the story widens. It's no longer about Trump versus Crockett. It's about a shared cultural script. Each story echoes the last, not because they were coordinated, but because they rhyme. The repetition becomes its own form of corroboration. What's striking in these moments is the absence of overt partisanship. Some speakers identify as Republicans, some don't identify at all. The common thread isn't ideology, it's experience. That's what makes the reactions hard to dismiss as scripted or staged within the narrative. You can argue with opinions, but arguing with parallel life stories is harder. Trump's responses to these testimonies are defensive in a way that reveals the limits of his frame. He keeps returning to women he knows personally, women who support him, women he's hired or praised. That move isn't irrelevant, but it sidesteps the question being asked. The question isn't whether he has women in his life, it's how he treats women who oppose him. By refusing to engage that distinction, he reinforces it. As more women speak, the room begins to function less like a town hall and more like a mirror. The stories pile up until they form a pattern no single rebuttal can dissolve. Crockett's role in this phase is minimal by design. She doesn't interrupt. She doesn't comment. She doesn't steer the emotion. She lets the accumulation do the work. The turning point comes not with a shout, but with an invitation. When Crockett asks the women in the room to stand if they've ever been called nasty for speaking the truth, she isn't staging a stunt. She's translating an abstract argument into a physical one. Standing requires no rhetoric, no explanation, no persuasion. It's a binary response to a binary question. The image that follows carries weight because of its simplicity. Women from across generations, backgrounds, and political affiliations rise together. There's no chant, no applause, no slogan. The silence is the message, a collective acknowledgement that the experience is not isolated. In visual terms, it's devastatingly clear. Trump's reaction to this moment, as depicted, is confusion shading into anger. The usual levers don't work here because there's no single opponent to attack. You can't shout down 200 people standing quietly. You can't argue with posture. The absence of noise deprives him of the conflict he thrives on. Crockett's framing of the moment is careful and restrained. She doesn't declare victory or assign blame. She redefines the insult itself, stripping it of its intended sting. By reframing nasty as a sign of resistance rather than a flaw, she flips the power dynamic. The word loses its ability to wound because its meaning has been reclaimed. This reframing is what allows the narrative to move beyond a single confrontation. If the story ended with Trump leaving the stage, it would still be compelling, but it would be incomplete. The real impact unfolds afterward, in reactions and reverberations. The moment becomes a reference point, something people return to in conversations and posts. It stops belonging to the participants and starts belonging to the audience. Trump's post-broadcast behavior, in this account, reinforces rather than undermines Crockett's analysis. The rapid-fire social media posts, the escalating accusations, the repeated use of the same language all serve as unintentional evidence. Each attempt to reassert control reads as further proof of the pattern. The contradiction between claims of victory and visible agitation widens. The gap between self-image and public perception grows harder to ignore. Media reaction amplifies the moment, but it doesn't create it. The footage of the women standing circulates because it's self-explanatory. There's no voiceover needed to tell viewers what they're seeing. That kind of clarity is rare in political media, which usually relies on framing to assign meaning. Here, the meaning is embedded in the image. Polling shifts are noted not as triumphalist statistics, but as indicators of resonance. They suggest that something cut through noise in a way messaging often fails to do. Whether those shifts endure is an open question, but the immediate response is undeniable. More telling than numbers, though, is the volume of personal stories that follow. People don't just react, they disclose. The outpouring of stories matters because it reveals the scale of the experience being named. When thousands of women share moments of being dismissed or belittled, the argument about exaggeration collapses. No single story is definitive, but the mass of them becomes persuasive. The narrative isn't about proving a thesis, it's about acknowledging a reality that has been quietly normalized. In that sense, the town hall acts as a catalyst rather than a conclusion. Crockett's decision to step back from the spotlight afterward reinforces the tone of the narrative. She doesn't capitalize on the moment with a media tour or personal branding push. She returns to work, framing the event as one instance of a larger conversation. That restraint bolsters the credibility of her role as analyst rather than provocateur. It suggests that the goal was exposure, not personal elevation. Throughout the main body of this account, the emphasis remains on language as a form of power. Not power in the abstract, but power exercised through repetition and normalization. Trump's defenders might argue that words shouldn't matter this much, that people are too sensitive. The counterpoint offered here is that words matter precisely because they teach behavior. When leaders model contempt, it travels downward. The narrative never asks the audience to adopt a single political position. It asks them to pay attention to how authority reacts to resistance. That question cuts across ideology because it applies wherever power is uneven. The story resonates not because Trump is unique, but because he is familiar. He embodies patterns many people recognize from smaller stages. By the time the main body reaches its later moments, the confrontation itself feels almost secondary. What lingers is the recognition in the room, the shared understanding that something long minimized has been named. The insult that once silenced becomes a signal of solidarity. The reflex that once shut conversations down becomes the thing that opens them. And in that inversion, the story finds its deeper significance. The main body doesn't resolve the tension neatly because real cultural shifts rarely do. It leaves space for disagreement, skepticism, and backlash. But it also leaves behind an image that's hard to erase. A room full of women standing, not shouting, not chanting, just refusing to sit. That image reframes the conversation from accusation to acknowledgement. It asks viewers to decide what they saw and what they're willing to keep seeing going forward. The reaction that follows inside the studio doesn't end when the women sit back down, because moments like that don't collapse neatly back into format. The chairs scrape softly against the floor, microphones are adjusted, the moderator attempts to regain rhythm, but the emotional geometry of the room has already changed. What was once a two-sided exchange has become asymmetrical, weighted by something heavier than argument. Trump returns to his podium not as the dominant presence he expects to be, but as a man outpaced by a realization he can't reverse. And the cameras, indifferent to intention, record that shift with unforgiving clarity. In political television, composure is currency. Candidates can survive hostile questions if they maintain a sense of command, if they look like they are choosing their responses rather than reacting to them. What undermines Trump in this stretch of the narrative isn't any single question, but the cumulative effect of losing that composure. His voice rises, his gestures widen, his interruptions increase in frequency and decrease in effectiveness. Each attempt to seize control only highlights how little control he has over the frame that's now enclosing him. Crockett, by contrast, barely changes. That consistency becomes its own argument because it refuses to validate the idea that authority must be loud to be real. She doesn't smirk or gloat, and she doesn't press for concessions she knows won't come. Instead, she lets Trump demonstrate the limits of his own rhetoric in real time. In a sense, she stops debating him and starts documenting him. This is where the town hall stops functioning like a political event and starts functioning like a case study. Viewers are no longer asked to choose sides based on ideology, but to evaluate behavior based on evidence. The question quietly shifts from, "Do you agree with her?" to, "Do you recognize this?" And recognition is far more destabilizing than disagreement. You can dismiss an opponent, but it's much harder to dismiss a pattern you've seen play out in your own life. Trump repeatedly tries to reframe the situation as personal disrespect. He insists that he's being treated unfairly, that the format is hostile, that the network is out to get him. Those claims aren't new, but in this context, they lose their usual traction. The audience has just watched women from vastly different backgrounds describe the same dismissive language. Media bias doesn't explain that convergence. When Crockett briefly re-enters the conversation, it's not to escalate, but to clarify. She draws a careful distinction between responsibility and blame, a line that matters if the analysis is going to stay credible. She doesn't argue that Trump caused every bad experience the women described. She argues that his language legitimizes a way of responding to women who resist. That distinction keeps the focus where it belongs, on influence rather than omnipotence. This restraint frustrates Trump because it denies him the caricature he wants to fight. He keeps looking for an attack to counterpunch, a motive to expose, a bias to weaponize. Instead, he's offered observation, and observation doesn't give him anything to hit without making himself the spectacle. The more he insists he's the victim, the more the audience sees a mismatch between power and grievance. As the broadcast continues, time itself becomes a factor. Trump complains that he's been under attack for an hour, even though the clock tells a different story. That exaggeration is subtle but revealing, because it shows how perception warps under scrutiny. Being questioned by a woman who won't yield feels longer, harsher, more hostile than it actually is. That reaction mirrors the very dynamic Crockett has been describing. The moderator's attempts to steer the conversation back to policy feel almost beside the point now. Questions about childcare, workplace equity, and healthcare float briefly, then sink under the weight of what's already unfolded. Not because those issues don't matter, but because the audience has just been shown the lens through which they're often filtered. Policy debates don't happen in a vacuum. They happen through people. And people bring their habits, biases, and reflexes with them into every discussion. Trump's answers to these policy questions revert to familiar territory. He cites economic numbers, praises women he's promoted, and returns repeatedly to personal anecdotes. None of that is inherently disqualifying, but it no longer lands the way it might have earlier. The audience has been primed to listen not just to what he says, but to how he reacts when challenged. And every interruption, every dismissive aside, echoes louder now. Crockett's choice to step physically toward the audience rather than toward Trump is symbolically important. It signals that the conversation is no longer about winning an exchange with him. It's about acknowledging the people in the room who have been carrying this experience quietly. When she speaks to them, her tone softens, not into sentimentality, but into recognition. She's naming something they already own. The standing moment reverberates beyond the studio because it's legible without explanation. Anyone watching can understand what it means to stand when asked if you've been diminished. It's an instinctive response, not an intellectual one. That's why the clip travels so quickly online, stripped of commentary and graphics. It doesn't need context to be understood. Trump's exit from the stage, as described, isn't framed as defeat in a conventional sense. There's no scoreboard, no formal declaration of a winner. What makes it resonate is the contrast between expectation and outcome. He entered believing the room would bend to him, and he leaves because it won't. That reversal is the story, not the walk itself. In the aftermath, the narrative pays close attention to Trump's own words, especially online. His posts cycle through denial, accusation, projection, and self-congratulation in rapid succession. Each post contradicts the last, but they're unified by tone rather than logic. The insistence that he won sits uneasily next to the volume of anger. The gap between claim and behavior becomes impossible to ignore. This digital aftermath matters because it extends the pattern beyond the controlled environment of television. On stage, there were moderators, time limits, and cameras. Online, there's only impulse. The repetition of the same language, the same grievances, the same insults reinforces the analysis retroactively. The behavior doesn't change when the spotlight shifts. It intensifies. Media coverage amplifies the moment, but it doesn't fundamentally alter its meaning. Different networks emphasize different aspects, as they always do. Some focus on Trump's anger, some on Crockett's composure, some on the women in the audience. But the image that cuts through is consistent across platforms. A room full of women standing silently has no obvious partisan spin. Polling numbers appear in the narrative not as a victory lap, but as a signal. They suggest that something pierced the usual defenses, at least temporarily. Whether those numbers hold is less important than what they represent. They indicate that language, often dismissed as secondary to policy, still has political consequences, especially when it aligns with lived experience. The flood of personal stories that follows is treated with gravity rather than celebration. These aren't testimonials recruited for a campaign, they're disclosures people have been waiting to make. The volume itself becomes the point. Overwhelming attempts to frame the moment as isolated or staged. Each story reinforces the idea that the insult was never just about one woman on one stage. It was about a culture that rewards silence and punishes resistance. What emerges is a collective reframing of a word that once functioned as a muzzle. Nasty stops meaning unruly or unpleasant, and starts meaning unmanageable. Unmanageable by people who expect deference, by systems that reward compliance. The insult loses its power because its target changes. It no longer lands on the woman. It rebounds onto the person who uses it. Crockett's refusal to center herself in the aftermath reinforces the credibility of the moment. She doesn't monetize it with endless appearances or turn it into a personal brand. That absence of self-promotion matters, because it keeps the focus on the issue rather than the individual. It suggests that the confrontation was a means, not an end. The work, as she frames it, continues elsewhere. The main body of this narrative ultimately functions as an examination of how power reacts when it's named. Trump is not portrayed as uniquely monstrous, but as emblematic. His language reflects a broader tendency to equate challenge with disrespect when it comes from women. That tendency exists far beyond him, in offices, schools, and institutions. The reason the moment resonates is because it's recognizable. By maintaining a neutral analytical tone, the story avoids the trap of turning into a morality play. There are no heroes crowned and no villains banished. Instead, there is behavior observed, responses catalogued, and consequences noted. The audience is trusted to draw conclusions without being dragged there. That trust is part of what makes the narrative persuasive rather than polemical. As the main body draws toward its end, the emphasis returns to the idea of pattern. One insult can be dismissed as a bad day. 10 can be spun as coincidence. Hundreds become a system. And systems, once seen, are hard to unsee. The town hall doesn't resolve America's debates about gender, power, or politics. It doesn't claim to. What it does, in this telling, is remove a layer of denial that has long insulated certain behaviors from scrutiny. It invites viewers to notice the reflexes they've been trained to excuse. And once that noticing begins, the conversation can't return to where it was before. That is the core of the main body's argument. Not that one man was exposed, but that a pattern was made visible. Not that an insult was defeated, but that its mechanism was understood. Not that silence was broken by shouting, but that it was broken by standing. And in politics, as in life, understanding how power speaks is often the first step toward deciding whether to listen. What ultimately lingers from this account isn't the argument itself, but the shift in perspective it forces on the viewer. Long after the clips stop looping and the hashtags fade, the central question remains uncomfortable in its simplicity. Not whether Donald Trump meant to offend, not whether his supporters excuse his tone, not whether his critics overreact. The question is what his language reveals about how power responds when it is challenged by women. And once that question is asked plainly, it becomes difficult to set aside. The town hall, as reconstructed here, works because it refuses the familiar script of outrage and counter-outrage. There is no demand for confession, no theatrical condemnation, no attempt to humiliate for sport. Instead, there is a slow, methodical narrowing of focus from personality to pattern, from isolated incidents to repetition, from individual insult to cultural signal. Trump's defenders could argue, with some justification, that he insults everyone. That rough language is part of his brand. That voters who support him aren't looking for politeness, but for confrontation. Those arguments have existed for years, and they still resonate with millions. What this moment disrupts is not their logic, but their sufficiency. Because even if one accepts that Trump is indiscriminate in his aggression, the texture of that aggression still matters. The story doesn't hinge on whether he insults men and women equally often. It hinges on how he insults them, and what those insults are designed to do. Questioning a man's competence is different from questioning a woman's worth. One challenges performance, the other polices identity. That distinction sits at the heart of why this narrative connects beyond partisan lines. You don't need to oppose Trump politically to recognize the language. You only need to have heard it before, directed at yourself or someone you respect. The words change slightly, the tone shifts, but the message is consistent. Stay in line, or be labeled. The women who stood in that room don't stand as symbols of ideological unity. They stand as evidence of shared experience. Some will still vote Republican. Some will never vote Republican again. That isn't the point being made here. The point is that recognition cuts across belief systems. It bypasses argument and goes straight to memory. That's why the moment works visually and emotionally without narration. Standing requires no explanation. Silence requires no translation. In political culture, especially on television, volume is often mistaken for authority. The loudest voice is treated as the strongest. But what this story illustrates is that authority can fracture when confronted with collective calm. Not because calm is superior in some moral sense, but because it removes the fuel outrage depends on. Trump's repeated insistence that he was being treated unfairly lands differently in that context. Power complaining about mistreatment rarely reads as persuasive when the imbalance is visible. A former president railing against a congresswoman's tone feels discordant when the room is full of women who have navigated far harsher dismissals without microphones or platforms. The complaint isn't illegitimate, but it is unconvincing. The scale doesn't match the grievance. The story's restraint is what keeps it from collapsing into caricature. Trump isn't portrayed as a monster lurking outside the norms of society. He is portrayed as a man operating comfortably within a norm many women know too well. That familiarity is what gives the narrative its bite. If he were exceptional, the lesson would be easier to dismiss. By refusing to turn the confrontation into a referendum on Trump alone, the conclusion widens the lens. It invites viewers to examine other places where similar language shows up. In workplaces where assertive women are difficult, in classrooms where outspoken girls are bossy, in public life where female authority is always provisional, always conditional. The reframing of nasty is significant not because it rebrands an insult, but because it drains it of its intended function. Once the word is understood as a reflex rather than a verdict, it loses its power to end conversations. It becomes diagnostic instead of disciplinary. When someone reaches for it, they reveal something about their discomfort with resistance, and that revelation shifts the balance. Crockett's role in this narrative ends deliberately without triumph. She doesn't claim ownership of the movement that follows. She doesn't position herself as the voice of all women. That humility matters, because it keeps the moment from being reduced to personality politics. The story belongs to the recognition, not the recognizer. The aftermath described here underscores a truth often overlooked in political analysis. Moments that resonate don't always do so because they are dramatic. They resonate because they articulate something people have been carrying silently. When that burden is named, even briefly, it changes how people interpret what they see next. The lens shifts, and it rarely shifts back. This doesn't mean minds are permanently changed or divisions suddenly healed. Politics is more stubborn than that. But it does mean that certain excuses become harder to deploy without scrutiny. Language that once slid by as just how he is becomes harder to ignore when its impact is laid bare. Normalizing behavior is easier before it's been mapped. In the end, this story isn't about humiliation or victory. It's about exposure, about taking a familiar dynamic and slowing it down enough for people to see its mechanics, about showing how power reacts when its shortcuts stop working, and about what happens when an insult stops landing where it's aimed. The final image is not Trump leaving the stage or Crockett standing at the podium. It's the image of women sitting back down after standing together. Not energized by spectacle, not intoxicated by triumph, just changed. Because once you recognize a pattern, you can't unknow it. That is the quiet force of this conclusion. It doesn't demand allegiance or outrage, it asks for attention, for viewers to notice how language is used to shape behavior and limit possibility, and to decide for themselves whether they're willing to keep accepting it. The story ends where it began, with a word that once functioned as a reflex. Nasty was meant to shrink. Here, it expands. It becomes a marker of resistance rather than reproach. And in that inversion, the power of the word changes hands, not through shouting, not through condemnation, but through understanding.